So the other day I sat down to record a video showing how to connect maths to your DFAM. And after a few minutes, I realized that I was spending most of my time just explaining how to use maths. So when I went and looked at the footage, it seemed to me that it was just kind of jumbled and kind of confusing. So I took a step back and I decided that this content just needed a video of its own. This video is going to be all about maths. So if you've been in modular at all, you probably know this module, have at least seen it, maybe even own it. It's been around now for, I think, like 10 years, maybe even more. When I bought my first modular rig, I sought out a lot of advice, and most people told me, get maths, and I didn't listen to them. I didn't listen to a lot of good advice when I first got started, but sometimes that's how learning goes. When I search on Modular Grid, it's in the racks of many of my favorite artists. So at one point I just said to myself, you know what? I'm gonna get this module eventually anyway. I'm just too curious in it, so I might as well just go out and buy it and see what it does. And right after I bought it, it ended up just sort of sitting there in my rack for a couple weeks. I had no idea how to use it. And in fact, I don't think I really even understood what it was actually used for. And there's a ton of other tutorials online and a ton of other articles on how to use it online. Trust me, I watched those and I read those when I was learning it. One of the things that made it click for me was I went out and I bought a Mordax Data, which is an oscilloscope and a lot of other stuff. But it gave me the ability to actually see what was going on inside of maths. And that was something I didn't see a whole lot of videos on. So that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to focus on showing you visuals from my Mordax Data and explain what is actually happening in maths and how it's affecting the signals that are going through it. And so that way you can have a clear idea of what it does and some possible ways that you could use it. So it's almost like a beginner's guide, I guess. I'm certainly not an expert on the subject, but I think having just gone through the process of being a beginner, I might be able to explain it to other beginners in a way that you might have not heard before. In the end, hopefully you have the same aha moment that I did with this module. The next video will be guiding you through a few patches of it, and then finally I'll go back to that original video where I show you how you can use it with your DFAM. Let's take a look. So let me start off with just really basic, what does this module even do? And I'm going to really oversimplify things, but basically it's a Swiss Army knife of control voltages. Not only can you make control voltages, but you can shape and change, move, flip, smooth, whatever you can think of. You can do all of those things to the control voltages. So it gives you a tremendous amount of control. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So on the Mordax Data, I have the time frame as 200 milliseconds. So that way we can see some LFOs. So let me start off by just patching from my Dofer quad LFO, a straight up triangle wave into the Mordax Data. Not surprisingly, this is what it looks like. Well, you can actually make the same exact LFO using maths. Let me show you. So I'm going to unplug from my Dofer and go into channel 1. And I'm going to talk more in more detail, but right now I just want to give you a quick overview of like some things it can do. And I'm going to turn the cycle on. So after some quick adjustments, what I've done is come out of the sum, and I'm using channel 1 and channel 2 together, and I've created a triangle LFO that's very similar to the one that I was getting out of my quad LFO. It's almost exactly the same, and if I wanted to spend more time on it, I could really dial it in and match them both up. But you get the point. I can make an LFO out of this. But here's where maths truly shines, is that not only can you make this LFO, but you can tweak it a lot. With the Dofer one, you're kind of limited, and you might have to use something like an attenuator or something else to change its shape. You have some control over the frequency range, but that's pretty much it. With maths, you can manipulate it in all kinds of ways. So for instance, here on the Mordax, The line in the middle where this yellow indicator is, that's neutral voltage. So everything below it's negative, everything above it is positive. Well, what if I wanted an LFO that only went in the positive range? I could use maths to generate that. By turning up channel 2, now the same LFO is operating just in the upper range. And with one module, rather than having to attenuate it using multiple modules, I can do it just from inside maths. So here, I'm pushing the LFO down so it's not as dramatic. I'm gonna bring it back up. Additionally, another thing I can do is change the shape of the LFO. So this knob here, I can change the actual slopes. So as I bring it up to an exponential range and increase the rise and decay time, notice how now the triangle LFO is more spiked and it's rounded at the bottom. I could also go the other direction, and with some subtle tweaking, I can make it act more like a bouncing ball. Let's set it back to just a regular triangle LFO for now. So this is back to the original shape. Well, you can easily morph between a triangle and, say, a sawtooth. By lowering the attack time, now my LFO is a sawtooth. And you can go, of course, anywhere in between that. You could have a slightly slower attack and a much longer decay. Pretty cool stuff. It's pretty much like if there's any type of shape of control voltage that you want, you can use maths to make it. And you can even blend multiple waveforms to make really funky and complex LFOs like this one. Check out that. That's pretty crazy. You certainly don't get shapes like that with basic LFOs. So that in a nutshell is what maths does. It helps you shape and get really creative with your control voltages. But it also is a great utility if you want to just do something in particular, like offset or inverse something, flip it over, or as I did before, you could have your control voltages be all positive as opposed to bipolar. And I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. And even as complex as that sounds, it's still way an oversimplification of the amount of things that you can do with this. I can't emphasize enough that I hear all the time from people who are much more experienced than me that they are still figuring out new things that they can do with maths. So again, I want to reiterate, this is not a complete tutorial. This is really just scratching the surface of what maths can do. So before I even got it, the first thing that immediately jumps out is the aesthetic design. I mean, really, that's something that jumps out about any of the Make Noise modules. They have that kind of crazy vibe, the fonts, and there's an unusual layout, and there's unusual markings. It's not immediately clear how the signal flow goes, and the labeling is sometimes kind of cryptic. I've heard that they do it to encourage creative patching, and whatever the reason, it can be a little bit intimidating for a beginner, and especially since I'm a big fan of Dofer and their clear and utilitarian designs, maths was pretty confusing for me when I first started. So let's just make sense of the interface. There are 4 channels. Channel 1 and channel 4 are very similar to each other, and channel 2 and channel 3 are very similar to each other. Channel 1 and 4 have some differences from channel 2 and 3. So while these are technically channels, that term confused me at first. Typically, when I think about a channel, I think about something like an audio channel in a mixer that requires something to run through it, and you don't actually need that here. Each channel is capable of producing its own voltage and contributing to the output whether or not something's plugged into the input. So it might be easier to think about them as 4 function generators or 4 envelope generators, 4 voltage generators, something like that. But whatever you call them, just keep in mind that you don't actually need to plug something in to use the channel. So let's take a look at channel 1 exclusively right now. This is the input. This is where you would put an audio signal if you wanted to do something like a gate or a control voltage, if you wanted to mangle it or adjust it somehow. This next one is the trigger. and it does say trig above it. So this is where you would put pulses or gates to tell maths to, say, trigger an envelope. And depending on what you're using it for, the trig input could be used for different purposes. This here is the cycle button. As you saw in the first example, you turn this on when you want something to be repeating, like an LFO, as opposed to an envelope gate. Right here are two knobs called rise and fall, and that's indicated by these arrows. The arrows are also something that kind of threw me off at first, because generally I think of envelopes as going up and coming down. And for this one to go up and then come back down this way, I was like, what is happening? I thought that's the way the signal was going or something. And I thought that this was like an output, but it's not, it's an input. So rise and fall are basically the same as attack and decay. This one controls how fast the signal goes up. This one controls how fast the signal goes down. And the arrows are connected to these inputs, and they are inputs for control voltages. So you could plug something in there to modulate how much rise there is, plug something in here to modulate how much decay there is. The one in the middle is both. So if you plug something in there, you can modulate both of these at the same time. This knob here controls the slope of these. As you saw in my example with the LFO, by turning it to the right, we get an exponential slope. So it starts slow and goes up fast. This line right here means it's linear. It goes in a line up and in a line down. And then over here is logarithmic, which is just basically the opposite of exponential. This last input is the cycle input, and that will turn this button on and off. When the voltage is low, it goes off, and when the voltage is high, it goes on. And I think if you activate the button here, it won't even matter what's plugged in here, so it won't turn off. You'd have to start it off, and then it would turn on and off. But that's what that controls. Okay, so those are the inputs for channel 1, and all of these things affect channel 1. Let's take a look at the outputs, because there's multiple outputs. This right here is the main output for channel 1, and it's labeled with a 1. So all the stuff that you do to mangle a signal, it should come out right here, and it's exclusively for channel 1. Over here, I think that's a function symbol in math, but it's been a long time, so if you know what that symbol is, go ahead and correct me in the comment section, but I'm pretty confident it stands for function. This light will indicate when something's happening in the channel. For instance, I'm cycling it now. That means a signal's passing through. And this output is the unity output. So this unity output, what it does, if I send a triangle LFO into math and then plug something into the output, notice how the Mordax is showing us that same typical triangle LFO. So the amplitude is matched by the incoming signal. So the main difference between the unity out, if you notice when I plug it in here, you're getting that triangle LFO. The main difference between that output and channel 1 is basically this attenuator. Notice how when it's up slightly, it squashes that LFO. But if I plug it back in here, the amplitude matches the incoming signal. Now over here, this one's pretty interesting. It's labeled E OR, and I thought that was some sort of logic function similar to OR or XOR, but it's not at all. It stands for end of rise. And if we plug in our Mordax there, you'll notice that you get these pulse wave. It's almost like a pulse wave LFO. It's going up at the end of the rise cycle. So if we turn our rise all the way up, it flattens out because it's going to wait until it gets all the way to the end. And I don't know how long it is, but it's a long time. So if we set it for a bit of a longer rise with a long decay, it's also going to flatten out higher because it's going to rise up and it's going to take a really long time to get back down again. Here, let's see if I can get two things going at the same time. So here I've got maths generating its own LFO, and this is what it looks like. At the end of every rise cycle, it triggers the pulse to go up, and at the end of each cycle, it goes back down again. It's only low when it's rising, and only high when it's falling. Now that actually is the only difference between channel 1 and channel 4. Remember how I said they were similar, but there was a slight difference? Channel 4 is just a mirror image of channel 1 with the input, trigger, the rise, the fall, the slope, Channel 1 has an end of rise, so that means that the pulse is high during the decay stage and low during the rise stage, that it triggers the high voltage at the very end of the rise function. Channel 4 is the opposite. It's the end of cycle, or the end of the decay. So notice how on the Mordax, when it's plugged into channel 1, it's high, the green is high voltage during the decay stage. If we move over to channel 4, you'll notice that the voltage is high during the attack stage. So it's a subtle but very important difference that we're going to use later when I show you some different functions that you can patch with this. Okay, so we've gotten channel 1, we've gotten channel 4. What's up with channel 2 and 3? Well, they're similar to each other but far less complicated. Unlike the two outside channels, the two inside channels don't have a trigger input. There's only an input, and these are attenuverters. So you can raise voltage, you can lower voltage, you can control how much voltage passes through them. It's very similar to like my Dofer attenuator here. The only difference is that these can go positive and negative, and this Dofer attenuator can only go positive. Dofer does make attenuverters. Now the only difference between 2 and 3 is that channel 2 can offset by 10 volts and channel 3 only by 5 volts. So channel 3 is a bit more subtle than channel 2, and channel 2 gives big voltages for big moves. But beyond that, they work exactly the same. So for instance, if we went back to our LFO, I think I showed this earlier, but let's just show it again. We notice the green LFO, and we can control how much of that signal is coming through. So right there it's at full. That's what this would be like if you just plugged it in straight without doing anything. So if you wanted it to have a very subtle effect, you could put it right there. There's no unity output, there's no cycle related stuff. They're pretty basic. So the final piece are these outputs. We have the 4 that go with the channels, and then we have these logic functions, or sum and inverted sum. The sum is pretty easy to explain because it's just everything from all the channels mashed together. So for instance, if I was taking channel 1 and I had this little LFO going, this is just channel 1. And if I took channel 2, it's just a control voltage. And it will stay linear wherever I set it. Now I really wish I could just plug a third one in here and show it on the Mordax, but unfortunately, the second you plug something in, unfortunately for this purpose, when you plug it into one of these channels, it takes it out of the sum. So I can't actually show you in real time what it would look like comparatively. But basically, if we were to unplug this and plug it into the sum, then I can control where that LFO sits by adjusting my 2 knob. I can have it be all negative, I can have it go positive, but I can control it, the amount of voltage that's coming out through this knob. So it mashes those 2 signals together. Let's take a look at the OR function. So the manual says that some people call this the maximum voltage selector circuit, and that to me makes a lot more sense. It's basically the highest voltage from any of the signals. So if you remember, channel 2 is just spitting out a constant voltage. So right now, let's look at it. It's set to about 4 volts. That's 2 up on the grid, it's that green line. And channel 1 is giving us this LFO. Let's even make it a little bit more dramatic. Let's have it go all the way up to the top. So that's what channel 1 looks like. So if you think about the maximum voltage going out at a time, if I plug it into this OR, what should happen is basically at 4 volts, which is 2 up on the grid, the bottom end of this LFO will get cut off. Let's see if I'm right. And there it is. It gets cut off right there. And if I wanted to lower that cutoff, I could just lower down my channel 2. Now, since it always shows the highest voltage and channel 1 is a positive LFO at this point, if I brought this down into negative voltage, it would have no impact. See, that's the same as channel 1. That's a complete beginner's rundown of everything that's going on in math. The next video I'm going to make is showing you some ways that you can patch this with a simple synth voice and generate a variety of kind of cool functions. And then after that, I'm going to get back to my original intention, which is showing how to use this with a DFAM. So I hope you like this video. Please like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments section. Also, if you're thinking about getting maths, I'm going to include a link to Perfect Circuit in my description. It's an affiliate link. It's a great way to support my channel, or really anyone's channel, at no extra cost to you. If you're going to buy it, you might as well just click through that link. And in fact, if you just go ahead and click through that link, you can buy anything from that store and I'll still get a small commission. So I know for me, it really helps me offset the cost of making all these videos. I've only had a handful of people actually purchase through my affiliate links. I notice when you do, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. That's really gonna help me out a lot. So that's my pitch. I hope you subscribe, and I'll see you next time.